Welcome back to the Brandmerry channel, where we are sharing personal branding and marketing advice to help you increase your revenue and impact. I'm Michelle Knight, founder and CEO of Brandmerry.com, and today I want to talk about storytelling, specifically how to share your brand story through your brand identity. All right, so before I get into this, we need to just talk about the power of storytelling. These are some stats. They're some of my favorite stats. If you've never heard me say them, welcome. It will not be the last time that you hear them. And if you've heard them before, well, we just need to go through them again. All right, so storytelling, as I've mentioned, is truly one of the most powerful things that you can use in your business because of how it allows you to connect with your audience. And there's a lot of cool stuff that happens when we share story through our content. One of the cool pieces as a content creator myself who spends time making that high value content, I want to make sure that my audience actually remembers that content. So when you incorporate story into your content, you are actually increasing the likelihood that your audience will remember it. In fact, you're increasing it by 22 times. Like, holy moly. If you're going to take that time to create those posts, don't you want people to actually remember them? Of course you do. I do. And so incorporating storytelling into your content, even if it's just a single sentence, allows you to do that. So it makes your content more memorable, which is very, very important when you're building that know, like, and trust factor with your audience. In addition to that, and we're going to nerd out a little bit, and that's going to be fine. In addition to that, there is a lot going on up here and in here when we tell stories in business. You know, I hear people say a lot like, well, my story doesn't connect with my audience, or I don't have a shared experience. And look, there's definitely a way to find those. I'm going to be talking about that in the workshop specifically. But here's the thing, it's not really about that. It's not really 100% about you guys having the same story or the same journey. It's just about the art of telling the story. By telling stories and by your audience reading and listening and ultimately receiving those stories, there's a lot going on inside of their brains, inside of their hearts, that is building that connection with you and with your brand. Neural coupling is one of the things that's happening, where the story is ultimately like triggering, firing their brain and connecting through the piece of content. Just because you're sharing a story, just storytelling does that. So it's activating the brain, it's keeping them engaged, which leads to them ultimately actually remembering your content. In addition to that, dopamine is released, which is the feel good, right? And so they're feeling good when they're reading your content, when they're seeing your stories, when they're hearing your stories, maybe on a podcast or however you're sharing your content. And that is powerful. And those are just two of the examples. I'll definitely share more in the workshop on what's happening in your audience's brain that is really contributing to the growth of your business, because this is how they become fans. This is truly how they become fans. So storytelling is very, very important. It can be incorporated at every single level of your business. And y'all just got to do it. Okay, that's it. No, I'm really, truly though, like the science is there. We just need to learn the strategies to actually do it, because I know that it can be overwhelming to kind of figure out like, what is story? How do we use that? So to take it back, let's talk today specifically on how it helps your brand as a whole. And to kick that off, I want to talk about brand identity. So brand identity is the personality of your brand. It is that experience that you are creating. It is the combination of values, your mission, how you want people to feel, that emotional side. It's that entire experience. And it's one of my favorite things to talk about. And you've actually probably heard me just refer to it as branding, because to me, that's truly what it is. We have had such an evolution with what branding is and what's important when it comes to branding, from just thinking it was like a logo and like your colors, to understanding what it really is. And that is that human connection, those values, that mission, that emotional connection. And so I will refer to just brand identity as branding, right? I interchange them all the time because that's just the direction that we're heading with branding overall. But it's really about that experience, creating that experience, and putting a personality to your brand. And when you're creating a personal brand, hey, right, kind of about you, like if you're in a service-based business, even if you sell a product, you want to share the behind the scenes of that product and the creation of that product and how that came to be. It makes it a lot easier because you're front and center. You're sharing yourself, you're sharing your stories. And so that personality just kind of naturally happens. And it's so powerful when we focus on that personal branding. And so if you want to learn a little bit more about emotional branding and all those different things after this video, make sure you definitely check out my blog. I have tons of content over there on emotional branding and just the foundational pieces of branding. I've got some YouTube videos on it. And if you go to my Facebook, I've got an entire folder of videos on that as well. But that's really the essence of it, all right? That personality, that experience that you are creating. So now that we know what your brand identity is, let's talk about how we use our story to ultimately share that brand identity with the world, create that experience. So the first thing that you've got to do is figure out what your brand story is in order to in order to, do the brand story, got to know the brand story. So this will look different for different types of businesses. There are different ways and structures to actually kind of create your brand story based on your story, based on your business. But really what I want you to focus on now is strip away the how do I write this on my About Me page? And what does this look like on, my bio on my homepage? Strip all that away and just focus solely on the story. In fact, when you're writing this out, I want you to think about actually telling this story to someone. Some of you might want to even record it and transcribe it. It might feel a little bit more natural to you. But what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to highlight and share the journey that has happened that led you to the creation of your brand. And again, your brand is not a product, your brand is not a service specifically. It's the whole thing. It's that umbrella. It's the work that you're putting out into the world. It's your mission. It's who you ultimately want to impact. And you want to share the evolution of how that came to be. So again, I want you to strip away how is this structured? How does this flow? And really just allow yourself to tell the story. That's where all the goodness gets to go in. And then when we format it and we worry about all that later, we can pull out the unnecessary pieces and clean it up a bit. But I want you to just deeply understand what has led you to this moment and think of really telling that story to your audience. For example, when I talk about my brand story, one piece of that is really this underlying feeling of not living a life based on other people's expectations or going against the status quo. And I will know that that's important to my audience. That's important to you. That's something that you also believe in. And I share that through my storytelling and I share that through my brand story to get that message across. So you're probably already picking up on it, but your brand story is where that connection can really start for many of you, because once we get to formatting it for an About Me page or we get to putting it out there in social media, it might be one of the first things that people see, and you have an opportunity to build that connection with them right out of the gate. So again, I want you to really take your audience on this journey, write out your brand story, and just become really clear on what you ultimately want to share about your journey and what has led you to the brand that you are creating today. So that's number one. All right. Number two on the back end is I want you to elevate it. I want you to think about that emotional side of it. And this is where we really take kind of your story and then spin it around to pull in your audience and build that trust with your audience. And I call these brand emotions. And you want to identify 5 brand emotions for your brand as a whole. Now, don't get too obsessed with the number. It could be 3, it can be 6, it could be 7. Don't do 25 or something like that, okay? I find 5's the sweet spot, but all you really want to ask yourself, write this down right now, how do I want my audience to feel? That's it, all right? How do you want people to feel? I mean, the reality is you've got 8 seconds to make an impression, and that's not a lot of time to read an entire message on a piece of content. It's not a lot of time to read a bunch of stuff on your homepage, and so you've got to make that first initial impression, and that really comes down to that emotional connection. How do people feel when they land on your website, when they see a piece of your content? And in order to exude that, in order to allow people to feel that, you need to know what you want people to feel. So take the time to identify those brand emotions. I want to give you 2 examples because I know sometimes this can be like, what do I want people to feel, Michelle? All right. So I have a client who is in the mindset space, the spiritual mindset space specifically, and she supports women in moving through a very difficult period of their life. She does a lot of shadow work, and so they're moving through a very hard time. They're currently in a difficult time, but they are moving towards the light, and they want to understand how to get there, and they want to feel supported through that process, and they want to do it in a way that feels good and not forced. And we know this about her audience. And so one of the things, and we also know from her brand story, she's really good at it. Like, she has her own journey that kind of mirrors that in a way, and she's really good at what she does. And so when we were thinking of her brand emotions, we wanted to show the light. We wanted to show what was possible and the desire, what her audience was wanting to move towards. But we also, because of her audience, didn't want to neglect where they were. And that was really, really important to communicate. And so we played with sharing that through messaging, through story, through brand colors, showing both the dark and the light. So that's just one example. But again, it just came back to, how do I want people to feel? And like, ultimately, what are they looking for? What are they searching for? With my brand, I decided very early on, well, actually, after 8 months of having a brand that was not me at all, I redid the whole thing, and now it's great. But when I redid it all, I got back to this core piece of storytelling and brand emotions, and I asked myself, like, how do I want people to feel? And it kept coming up for me that I wanted people to feel safe and comfortable, and that they could be their authentic selves, and that there was this like connection between the two of us, between my brand and between them and their story, that it almost felt like we were sitting, cozied up by a fire on a fall day, just having a really deep conversation and chat. And I used that to motivate all of these different pieces that we're going to talk about in just a second. So again, take the time to understand who you are and the journey that you've gone on to get to where you are, to have the brand, the mission, the values, the core beliefs, and the impact that you want to make in your ideal customer's life, as well as understand how do you want them to feel from the moment they come in contact with your brand, continued on through all of those different pieces. All right, so now that brings us to, now how do we actually use this, Michelle? Like, how do we use it? This all sounds great. I love it, but how do we use it? So now let's talk about how we use that brand story and those brand emotions to enhance and communicate and have this wonderful experience, also known as brand identity. So number 1, and I've kind of mentioned this already, has to do with the visual aspect. So you want to incorporate your storytelling as well as how you want people to feel into the visual aspect of your brand. Again, you've got about 8 seconds, so sorry that is true, to make an impression. And again, that's not a lot of time to read a whole social media post, watch an entire video, or even really read some of the top lines on your website. And so one of the things that captures people's attention right away and has an opportunity to build that connection are those visual aspects. And that's why a big part of branding are the colors and the fonts and the elements and the photos that you choose to tell that story. And so many people just choose those randomly, or like, I like this, I like that, and they're not actually telling the story of their brand or really making their audience feel anything. So again, when you're thinking about colors and fonts and elements, think about how you want your audience to feel. And when you're thinking about those brand photos, that's a really great way for you to also tell your brand story through those different photos. Whether you invest in brand photography, which I highly recommend, or have a tripod and do it yourself. And this is that initial ding that gets people to say, yeah, I'll keep going, I'll keep reading, I'll stick around, or exit out and close out the screen. So it's very important. It's like the subject line of an email, my friends. And you really want to use this to pull your audience in. If you are like, okay, great, love this, Michelle, but what am I ultimately wanting to make them feel, right? Maybe there's a little uncertainty around that. Here's kind of like a great starting point. Think about your audience's desires. Think about their aspirations. Think about how they want to feel when you support them in solving the problem, right? Everyone's got a problem. That's why they're seeking out your brand in the first place. When that problem is solved, or even start the process of solving that problem, what are they working towards? That's a really great place to start when you think about your brand emotions. All right. And then again, carrying those through all the visuals that you create, really taking time to learn about color psychology and the different meaning behind fonts and elements and all of that juicy stuff as well. Okay, so the second thing that you can do in order to carry your brand story into your brand identity is to create a clear message. Okay, so we talked about the visual, right? We've got the visual component that captures their attention. Now we've got to keep them engaged. And that is where your copy and your messaging comes into play. So you can use your values, your mission, your brand story, your journey to really communicate to your audience the purpose behind your brand. And this is very, very important. In fact, in my program, You Branded, I have all of my clients write out their mission statement because that is the guiding light. That is why we do everything that we do, why we show up, and why we're ultimately wanting to create a brand that is of service and of impact to our ideal customer. And so one of the best things that you can do is share that with your audience. Build that connection right out of the gate. This goes miles when you are building that experience, when you are sharing that personality, when you are elevating that brand identity, because consumers want to know the values and the mission behind a brand. We saw this really accelerate in 2020, and we are going to see it continue to play a vital role in branding, in consumer interactions, in why people buy, and ultimately the success of businesses as we continue. In fact, 77% of consumers say that they will buy from brands, and they buy from brands, right, that share the same values as they do. And 64% said that they would actually boycott a brand because of their values on political and social issues. So it is important, my friends. And many brands actually neglect sharing their values or even posting their mission or sharing their mission or communicating that. And it's one of the best things that you can do, as we've already shared with some statistics, which is my jam, that this is important. If you want to build a revenue generating business, you need to know this stuff and you need to clearly communicate it with your audience. It matters. And so one of the ways, just one, there's a lot, but just one of the ways that I love to do this is through the art of storytelling. Create stories and social content, incorporate them in your blogs all over the place that show your values, that share your values. You know, you don't just have to have a place on your website that says our company values. You totally can. That is absolutely fine. But in addition to that, I want you to also share that through your content, through your storytelling. It's very, very powerful. So if you're like, what kind of stories can I start sharing? Write out your brand values and then think of like, why is that a value for you? Why have you decided to incorporate that into your company and share that through your content as a way to really build deep brand affinity with your audience, which is essentially that connection between shared values of the brand and the consumer. And now, number 3, consistency, which is one of my favorite words. And I think something every single business needs to be putting a lot of emphasis on. You know, we talk about content creation a lot. It is a core piece of building an online business, of making sure that you're attracting your audience and showing up for them, nurturing them, leading them through the buying process, ultimately to the sale. And so we talk about consistent content all the time. But what about consistent messaging? That is very, very important because you can create a bunch of different content, but if your audience doesn't clearly understand what you offer them, how it's going to support them, and again, those brand values, that mission, your story to build that trust, you're going to feel all over the place to your audience. And therefore, there's going to be that break in trust, and that's going to affect sales. So when you are thinking about sharing your brand story as a way to amplify your brand identity, what you really want to focus on are those consistent messages. And again, it comes back to what we talked about in the very beginning, understanding your story, your values, and your mission, and then consistently sharing that with your audience, as well as creating this linear path on how you want your audience to feel with every single thing that you create. So if they land on your website, they read a social media post, they watch a live video, they see you at an event, it all feels the same. It all feels like you. It all feels like your brand identity. That's very, very important. This is where the magic happens. And this is really where you get to share these stories on your values, as we mentioned before, to improve and create that brand affinity with your audience. There you have it. 3 strategic ways to start sharing your brand story through your brand identity, creating that personality and that experience that your audience can't get enough of. This is how we create true fans. I love talking about storytelling. It is a foundational piece in everything that I teach, and in fact, is a key component in building those solid brand foundations. If you want to learn more about how to build those brand foundations, some mistakes you might be making, and how to incorporate storytelling at every single level, you can watch my free class, the Build a Better Brand Method, and you can get signed up at brandmerry.com/brand masterclass. You can also click below in the description. I'll take you right there. Sign up for the next available time and dive right into it. We have entrepreneurs who are watching this training just starting out and wanting to have that solid foundation. And I have a lot of entrepreneurs who have been doing this for a little while that feel like something's missing or are just ready to really share those values and share that mission and elevate their brand identity as a whole. And they are getting so much from the class. So make sure you save your seat at brandmerry.com/brand masterclass. And I will see you next week for another video. Until then, subscribe so you don't miss it. Hit the like button, leave me a comment below, and I'll see you really, really soon.